Now, those of you old enough to remember Beatlemania or the Bay City Rollers, or perhaps more recently the Beliebers, you'll know that teenagers can get a little hysterical. Usually it happens in a crowd, but sometimes it can happen on a podium.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones.
This girl, of course, should be cared for rather than paraded around, and she might want to meet some disadvantaged kids from Somalia, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, or even outback Australia before she talks about stolen childhoods. But sadly, many people seem to be trumpeting their moral superiority by taking her seriously, or at least pretending to. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met with this 16-year-old who says people are dying and the world is being destroyed. Even still, Greta Thunberg complained and said Trudeau wasn't doing enough. You've got to feel sorry for Trudeau. Here's a bloke who once turned his whole face into a carbon sink, his legs too, and the climate alarmists still don't think it's enough. One day, probably after he leaves politics, Trudeau will realise there is no appeasing the apocalyptic Green left. Still, he's not the only person taking Thunberg seriously. Journalists and commentators who routinely demand we debate facts and science have been lionising her.
Yeah, amazing speech, amazing package that was put together there as well. Where do people like Greta come from?
I know, it's funny you say that. When I was looking at Greta, I was thinking there's so much just to be so depressed about. And then you see her seeing the kids at the rally, and I was like, how soon can they vote? How soon can they be our leaders? Like, they are our future. Yeah. At least they get it.
It's interesting because she does present this as a war. It's us against you. Yeah. And we will not forgive you. I mean, this is from a place that we haven't heard people speaking before, don't you think?
But it's also not just it's a war. It's like it's a war and we're going to win it. You can choose to stop this being a war by getting on board right now. If not, it's coming for you, which is incredibly bolshy. And that's what gives her the power, I think.
Wow, a teenage war we can believe in, hey? Now, the ABC in Newcastle asked listeners to compare Thunberg's speech to Winston Churchill, Martin Luther King and JFK. The Guardian's Richard Flanagan compared her threatening spiel to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And in the Sydney Morning Herald, Mitchell Adams was lauding Thunberg as a true leader by every definition. I assure you, I am not making this stuff up. These are real live examples of real live adults reacting to the overwrought climate catastrophist. There was some inexcusably nasty abuse directed at Thunberg. Former footy show host Sam Newman was the worst, labelling her not just a little brat, but an SHIT who shouldn't be given a platform. He described her enablers as inbred sycophants. But most critics attack Thunberg's arguments, the silliness of those applauding her, and how she's being used as a political pawn. Miranda Devine, watching up close in the US, said Greta wasn't inspiring, but rather was a victim of child abuse. And former Coalition Minister Amanda Vanstone wrote in The Age, I don't think telling people they'll never be forgiven, berating them with how dare you, does much to bring people on board. Usually it has the opposite effect. It's just another sad example of serious and complex political issues being reduced to I'm right and you're an idiot. That kind of discourse just pollutes the town square. It's fractious and shuts others out. It is toxic to democratic debate. Others were angered by the hectoring.
This was Kevin Rudd a short time ago.
I think she represents the anger of that generation and does so effectively. It might insult a whole lot of middle-aged white guys because it's not the way in which we would talk, or we think that's inappropriate for a young girl to speak that way.
I'll tell you what, I'm an insolved middle-aged white guy this afternoon. Kevin Rudd, give it a rest. There's anger out there. Of course there's anger. There's anger at this kind of activism as well.
So, of course, Karl Stefanovic became the next target. The ABC's Michael Rowland, of course, exaggerating criticism as a pile-on against a young girl. Julia Baird also took exception.
I'll ask you as well about some of the generational reactions, because there is something about Greta Thunberg that seems to trigger some people. She's been abused on a number of fronts. She's been for her autism, which she says is her superpower.
And the ABC also ran Melbourne University professor Lauren Rosewarne, who said The moment girls scream and cry over something is the moment our culture has decided it's wholly unimportant. We like certain 16-year-olds, ideally ones that look like they're on the cusp of blossoming into womanhood, barely legal in porn parlance. Oh dear. As usual at the ABC, it's not just the journalists whose thoughts align. The comedians also fly in formation.
Hi, I'm a middle-aged man with an embarrassing problem. I get irrationally angry at a Swedish girl who wants to save the planet. Luckily, there's now a number I can call.
Hello, you've called the Greta Thunberg helpline.
If you're a grown adult who needs to yell at a child for some reason, the Greta Thunberg helpline is here to tolerate you.
She's just fueling needless anxiety. She's making the end of the world sound like it's the end of the world.
Well, at least that was mildly amusing. Well, I thought so, at least. Perhaps they could have a hotline where you could ring and yell at the ABC. Perhaps it would be funnier, too, to think of a world outsourcing its most complex dilemmas to teenagers skipping school. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? For an issue where many journalists describe as the most pressing, they describe it as the most pressing issue for the entire planet, a lot of them seem to prefer emotion and stunts from impressionable teenagers over delving into the difficult scientific and policy questions.